Welcome to today's Nicaragua webinar entitled Nicaragua, Standing Tall to the Wrecking Ball. We will hear from three speakers, Dan Kovalik, Nan McCurdy, and Sarah Flounders, followed by a period for questions and answers during which John Perry is also available to answer questions. Many thanks to Yoav Elenevsky, who is providing our technical support, and we welcome Louise Richards as a co-moderator today. We also thank our many organizational co-sponsors who are being listed now in the chat. My name is Barbara Larkham, and I'll serve as the co-moderator today. I'm the co-organizer of this Nicaragua webinar series, along with Nan McCurdy. Louise?
I'm Louise Richards of the Nicaragua Solidarity Campaign Action Group in the United Kingdom. I am Trade Union and Communications Coordinator with the organisation. There is a website for our organisation. We produce regular monthly updates, and I'll be putting a link to our website in the chat. You'll see there is a chat function available at the bottom of the screen, and we'll be posting throughout the webinar various links and information which I'm sure you'll be interested in. There are also closed captions available. Again, there's a little button, CC, at the bottom right hand of your screen. Just click on that and you'll be able to access the closed captions. There's another button labeled question and answer Q&A at the bottom of your screen. Please place your questions for the speakers in the Q&A, not in the chat, to make sure we see them. Barbara and I will pull your questions to pose to the speakers at the end of the webinar. Be patient. We are making a note of all the questions, but they may not be answered until the question and answer period.
Before we begin, we have several announcements. We'll make sure to post all the information and links in the chat as well. Today's event is part of an ongoing monthly series about Nicaragua. Please mark your calendars now for the next two webinars in the series. On April 23rd, the title is Terps Abroad, Maryland Students Tour Agriculture or Agroecology in Nicaragua. It features Professor Richard Cohn and several of his agriculture students at the University of Maryland. On May 28th, the title is The View from the Ground, What We Experienced in Nicaragua in 2018. The speakers are four persons who lived through the attempted coup and describe how it has affected their current effort and understanding. Both of these webinars, April 23rd and May 28th, are on Sunday at the same time as today in the Western Hemisphere, but at 8:00 p.m. in the UK. This Tuesday at 3 p.m. Eastern Time, Sarah Flounders is in another webinar to discuss the sanctions book and present it to the Miguel de Escoto Brookman Sovereignty House in Managua. Registration information will be in the chat. If you'd like to become more active in supporting Nicaragua's sovereignty and opposing U.S. interference there, you're invited to join our international coalition with a new official name, Nicaragua Solidarity Coalition. We're working to spread more accurate information about what's really happening in Nicaragua. Please check our new website regularly at nicasolidarity.net. Also, please put your name and email address in the Q&A if you'd like our weekly newsletter and monthly meeting notices. Our next coalition meeting is tomorrow, Monday, March 13th at 2:30 p.m. Eastern Time. So please do enter in the chat if you would like to be invited to that. Louise?
An important organisation in our coalition and a co-sponsor of this webinar series is Alliance for Global Justice, or afgj.org. AFGJ and its fiscally sponsored projects are under serious attack by right-wing media, which have managed to block Alliance for Global Justice from receiving credit card donations. We'll place in the chat a link to more information and ways you may be able to help them during this crisis. To save as much time as possible for this program, we'll enter some other information in the chat about other ways you can get involved or learn more about Nicaragua. The format for today's 90-minute webinar is as follows. Each of the three speakers will have about 15 minutes for their presentation. The remaining time will be for questions and answers. This webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be sent to all participants within the next few days. Our first speaker is Dan Kovalik, who teaches international human rights at the University of Pittsburgh School of Law. He is the author of a number of books, including the recently released Nicaragua, A History of US Intervention and Resistance. Welcome, Dan, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Louise, and thanks for everyone in attendance on a Saturday afternoon. I really appreciate that. We all do. I want to start with a quote that I think is a good reference point for this discussion. Apparently, when Nixon and Kissinger met with Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai in China in 1972, Nixon asked Zhou Enlai, he says, "What do you think about the French Revolution?" And Zhou Enlai said, "Too soon to tell." And I think what this reflects is the reality, not just of history, but what a revolution is. And that is to say, a revolution is not something that happens in one moment in time and is over. It's a process. You know, many people, if, to the extent they know anything about Nicaragua and the Sandinista Revolution, if they were quizzed and if you said, "Hey, when was the Nicaraguan Revolution?" they'd say, "Oh, July 19th, 1979. Of course, in a sense, they'd be correct. That's when the Sandinistas triumphed over Somoza. But the revolution did not end then, right? It's gone through various phases and had other enemies, for lack of a better word, to triumph over as the years went on. And I think that that is important to consider when we talk about Nicaragua. In the period that Nicaragua and the revolution are in now and have been since 2006, when Daniel Ortega was reelected after a hiatus of 16 years, is a very different period than it was in the 1980s. And I think that that's hard for a lot of people who went to Nicaragua in the 80s to wrap their heads around. I think a lot of people never understood the difference in those periods and what to expect. And I think that's why, you know, there have been a lot of people who fell away from the Sandinistas as a consequence. I want to just go over a little history that I assume most of you, if not all of you, know about, but I think it's always good to remind us of things. As Gore Vidal said about the United States, he called it the United States of amnesia. And I think that's correct. And it's an amnesia that is not accidental. We are really encouraged to forget about history because history is a powerful thing and it grounds us and it helps us understand events as they unfold currently. So first of all, let's start with the fact that the Sandinistas in 1979 triumphed over a dictatorship of Anastasio Somoza and his two sons that was installed with the help of the U.S. Marines in 1934. So between 1934 and 1979, the U.S. supported a very brutal dictatorship in Nicaragua, which held Nicaragua back, not just in terms of democracy, but also in terms of economic development. It really stunted the country's growth. Illiteracy remained very high. Poverty and extreme poverty remained very high. Ignorance in general remained high. People lived very difficult lives because of a dictatorship that looted the country. When there was the earthquake in 1972, a devastating earthquake that leveled Managua to the ground, right? became a known fact that Somoza was stealing all of the humanitarian aid. And this was the sort of thing he did, right? He did not operate in the interest of the Nicaraguan people. He operated in the interest of the United States and Wall Street bankers. Again, that has to be kept in mind. So the Sandinistas, beginning in 1961, slowly but gradually and progressively organized mostly peasants and working people to overthrow Somoza. But in the last year of the insurrection, 1978, Somoza's forces, which were obviously had much greater firepower than the Sandinistas, killed 50,000 Nicaraguans in that last year of the insurrection, and mostly by aerial bombings. So we talk about a dictator bombing their own cities. That was Somoza. He bombed his own cities, killing 50,000 people out of a population of somewhere just over 2.5 million people. That's a staggering number of people that were killed during that period. Still, the Sandinistas overthrew Somoza. They inherited a bankrupt treasury because Somoza stole all the wealth when he left town. An economy that was never developed in the first place, high illiteracy rates. And they began, of course, a period of social transformation to teach the poor to read and write, to try to develop the peasantry, to try to develop the economy, to try to make a more just and equitable society. And no sooner did they take over than the U.S. began plotting the Sandinistas' demise, right? And so we know before leaving office in early 1981, Jimmy Carter flew out the National Guardsmen of Somoza in planes marked with Red Cross insignia, which is a war crime, by the way, flew them to Honduras. And the CIA, with the help of the Argentine military, the fascist, remember this is the Argentina was run by a fascist government at the time, began organizing these Somocistas, these National Guardsmen, into the Contras. And I'll talk a bit about the Contras because it's important to discuss. But it's also important to discuss, well, how did these National Guardsmen, how could they be, brought to safety in Honduras? I mean, were they just walking around? And the answer is largely yes. I mean, the Sandinistas, the first thing they did, remember, was they suspended the death penalty. They allowed, first of all, a lot of Somocistas, a lot of the National Guardsmen just to leave Nicaragua in any case up to Honduras if they disarmed. And they were very forgiving towards the Somocistas, which allowed the U.S. to organize them against the people of Nicaragua, right? That every time the Sandinistas have shown mercy, which they do constantly, the U.S. has used this against them, has exploited their kindness to try to overthrow them. And that's something that needs to be kept in mind because that process continues to this very day. So the U.S. helped form the Contras. We know through the International Court of Justice case that Nicaragua successfully brought against the U.S. Of course, the U.S. never abided by it. That the Contras were directed by the United States, by the CIA. They really were, in small and big matters, at the orders of the CIA. They were a CIA tool, and they were a terrorist organization. Again, they destroyed the economy, which had already been destroyed by Somoza. They destroyed electrical power plants. They killed doctors. They killed judges. They killed teachers. They went after the softest spots of society. And they did so on the order of direction of the CIA with their torture and terrorist manual that the CIA put out, and which is described quite in lengthy detail in the International Court of Justice case. When you go over such details, in fact, it's one would almost believe you to be a conspiracy theory when you go through what the CIA and the US did to the Nicaraguans during the 1980s. By the time the 1980s were over, the Contras had killed about 30,000 people. Again, 30,000 on top of the 50,000 killed in the last year of the insurrection. Again, in a country with less than 3 million people. I mean, again, this is an amazing number of people. And again, they were killing some of the best and the brightest. That was the point, right? This is not only to kill, but to prevent proper development in the country. And we know, and again, this has to be pointed out. After 1987, when Congress, through 2 acts of Congress, cut off funding to the Contras, the Reagan administration continued to fund the Contras by selling cocaine on the streets of the United States, by selling arms illegally to Iran. At a time, the U.S. was funding a war, funding Iraq and its war against Iran, right? So one time the U.S. is giving aid to both countries in a brutal war that killed 1 million people. That's a whole nother story, but it's part of the story that's very important to show the lengths that the U.S. would go to destroy the Sandinista revolution. And, you know, when you talk to people, they'll be like, well, that was a long time ago. First of all, it wasn't a long time ago. You know, there's many people alive today who went through that, many people alive who fought against the Contras, many Contras still live today. This is not long time history. And it's important to remember that. Now, the first, it needs, again, to be reminded, because people are told, are told the opposite. You know, they're often told the first democratic elections in Nicaragua were in 1990. That's not true. They were in 1984, first free and fair elections. Sandinistas held free and fair elections during a war, which is pretty incredible. And they won them handily. That needs to be pointed out. It was the Sandinistas that brought democracy to Nicaragua. It wasn't Chamorro in the elections of 1990. And by the way, the 1990 elections were far from fair. In fact, they were anything but free and fair, because in the 1990 elections, the U.S. interfered in those elections in the most severe way you possibly could. And that is by telling the Nicaraguan people that if they did not vote for Chamorro and against the Sandinistas, the U.S. would continue the Contra War against Nicaragua and would continue the economic warfare. There is no more outrageous way to interfere in a country than through that. And that message was heard loud and clear, and the people did vote against the Sandinistas. They voted Chamorro in, and it was actually a very sad time in Nicaragua. People on the streets were not happy. They did what they had to do to survive, they thought, but they weren't thrilled that they were put under gunpoint to do that. And that's exactly what they were. Now, what was astounding, and I think I've never, and I've read other historians who've said the same thing I'm going to say, and I think historians agree, the Sandinistas would do something no other revolutionary group has ever done. So they won through armed struggle, the triumph against Somoza in 1979. They then lost elections in 1990. They would go on to slowly organize the population, to work hard in the next 16 years during very difficult times, horrible economic times, because the neoliberal governments that were in power during this period did a lot to overturn the gains of the Sandinista revolution. But the Sandinistas endured, they organized, and they would win. They would come back to power through the election box again in 2006. Again, there's no other example in history that I know of where a revolutionary group wins through arms, loses through elections, and then is reelected. This is an amazing feat that the Sandinistas should be applauded for. But the U.S., and by the way, it should be reminded when people talk about Ortega and how, he's this terrible dictator and whatnot. It should be reminded, people should be reminded that he ran for office. His vice presidential candidate was a former Contra leader, right? He worked very hard to try to build reconciliation and peace in that country. He also began working very closely with the Catholic Church and the business community, again, to try to bring peace and stability to the country after, again, the Contra War, after the terrible neoliberal economic period. He wanted to move forward for the people and made compromises I'm sure he was not happy with. And a lot of Sandinistas were not happy with, again, to find a way forward. But the U.S. was not done with him. And that's the point that people need to be reminded of. All the crazy things the U.S. did to try to unseat the Sandinistas in the 1980s, the viciousness they showed, that had not just disappeared. The U.S. would not suffer the Sandinistas gladly, right? And so what happened, and it shocked Nicaragua, and it shocked all of us, both, expats in Nicaragua and those of us living in the U.S., when in April 2018, there was this insurrection, this violent coup attempt against Ortega. And what was really surprising about it was that in October of 2017, so about 6 months prior, is that, if I'm getting my math right, Ortega had polled at about 80% approval, 80%, 80%. This is amazing. It was very popular. Since 2007, when he was reinaugurated, the economy had grown by 5% a year. Free medicine was reinstated. Free education was reinstated. Huge development projects were underway. The Sandinistas since 2007 have built, I believe, 26 world-class hospitals. People were happy, and they were happy with Daniel, okay? So that there was this major insurrection that spring and summer, took everyone, including the Sandinistas, I think, by surprise, because it made no sense given how popular the government was. But we see some reasons why this happened. So I have a quote here. It's actually from my book. You can see it. When the insurrection came in April, shortly after that, there was a May 2018 article in a magazine called Global Americans, which is a magazine funded by the U.S. National Endowment for Democracy. And here was what they said about the insurrection that was taking place. Quote, Nicaragua is on the brink of a civic insurrection. For 2 weeks, hundreds of thousands of citizens have occupied the streets protesting President Daniel Ortega and his wife and Vice President Rosario Murillo. The demonstrations and marches began following the government's slow response to a massive forest fire inside the Indio Maiz Bioreserve. A week later, again, which the Sandinistas had nothing to do with and actually did a lot to try to combat that fire. A week later, the movements quickly escalated when Ortega's government announced a series of austerity measures, and they weren't that austere, by the way, designed to rescue the country's social security system from the brink of bankruptcy. On the ground in Nicaragua, one gets the sense that Ortega's government is on the ropes. Global Americans explain that while the, quote, international press has depicted the rapid escalation of civil unrest in Nicaragua as a spontaneous explosion of collective discontent, it's becoming more and more clear that the U.S. support has helped play a major role in nurturing the current uprising, unquote. So here's an American publication funded by the NED that says, contrary to what you guys think, including you at Democracy Now! And you others who are listening to, the opposition in Nicaragua, that this is some spontaneous development, that all of a sudden people who were polling, who were supporting Ortega at a rate of 80%, now were on the streets violently trying to overthrow the government. lest you believe that was a spontaneous insurrection, what is the truth is that it was the U.S. that helped bring about this insurrection through, and they go on, through millions of dollars of assistance over the years to opposition groups who planned this insurrection for a long time. And one of the groups, by the way, that planned that insurrection within the walls of their churches was the mainstream U.S. Catholic Church. And that has to be pointed out when we see some priests being arrested and whatnot. They played a horribly treacherous role. How am I on time, by the way, Nan?
You're about out of it.
Okay, I'm going to finish up then. I'm going to finish up, if I may. I'll just mention a couple more salient points about that summer, which it took some of us, including myself, a little time to catch up that summer on what was happening, because it was a very confusing period for a lot of us. And I thank a lot of people on this webinar for helping me during that period to see what was happening. A lot of us, I didn't even know a lot of people on this webinar at that time, and I got to know them, and it's been a very enriching part of my life to get to know you, and I appreciate you. And I think we've all come together. That's the one thing the insurrection did. It did bring a lot of us together, which was a beautiful thing. A couple salient points. The Catholic Church, the first thing they did when they participated in the national dialogue, which Ortega organized with many stakeholders to try to bring peace to the situation there, was to demand that the police be removed from the streets. They said, the police are the ones that are doing the violence. Take them off the streets. And Ortega said, okay. Now, a lot of Sandinistas were quite surprised by this, because they knew that, in fact, it was the police trying to hold the line and keep some semblance of peace in the country, and that this could be disastrous. But Ortega said, okay. And he took the police off the streets for 50 days, 50 days. And by the way, the army never came out on the streets. The army general always took the position, hey, we exist to defend the homeland against foreign invaders. We don't get involved in domestic disputes. So the army was always in its barracks. Now Ortega put the police in their barracks for 50 days. And what became evident to the people who were confused at this time, and a lot of Nicaraguans were, they then realized who was doing the violence, because the violence did not abate. And in fact, a lot of police officers were attacked and killed at this time in their barracks. If you go up to Messiah, and John, you took me there to the police department there are pictures of all the police officers who were killed during this period, and it was substantial. Right? There's about a dozen photos or something of cops at that time. So people got wise as to who was committing this violence, and it was these violent insurrectionists that had been funded by the U.S. And in the end, one of the big groups that came out to end the violence, to end the tranques, the hundreds, if not thousands of tranques, these barricades that were put up throughout major cities in the countries, were the historic combatants, right? The people that we all love from the 1980s, who helped overthrow Somoza, who fought the Contras. They were the ones that said, we've had enough. And they came out and organized people to clear the tranques. Sandinista youth did as well. And it was the police that kind of came behind them and cleaned up. But it was really the historic combatants that were critical in this. People who hadn't fought for a long time, but then came out to fight for the revolution, which people need to know about. And I can just say, and I'll end this by saying, when I ended up in Nicaragua in July of 2018, 2 days after the last city, Moaning Bow, was liberated, and that's how they viewed it, by Sandinista forces, people were so relieved. People that I met told me what had happened over the summer, sobbing about the violence that was inflicted on them by these groups. And there was a major July 19th celebration that year, and a lot of people turned out to the plaza, even though they were all from Managua, because they were told, don't come from the other cities, it's too dangerous still. And yet there was a major, very spirited turnout to defend and support the revolution. And many people viewed that as another triumph of the Sandinistas. And I view that as well. And I think, again, I hope people consider what's happening today in the context of all those historic events. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Dan. We appreciate you too very much.
Thank you.
And you ran a little long, but I think everything you said was valuable. So we thank you a lot for stimulating our thinking. And now we turn to our next speaker, and that is Nan McCurdy, who is the editor of the weekly Nika Notes newsletter published by Alliance for Global Justice. Nan lived in Nicaragua for over 30 years, and she still spends a lot of time there with family and friends. Nan, please share your knowledge with us.
Thank you, Barbara, and thanks to everyone for being with us. If you live in the United States, probably if you live in the UK, you have recently been bombarded by disinformation describing the unfair treatment of 222 Nicaraguans. The corporate media has not ever told you that they were condemned for acts that would be serious crimes in any country in the world. But because their actions favored US interests, they are presented as people who fight for democracy. Today, I will share with you another side of the story that you're not going to hear in the corporate media. In the early morning of February 9th, in Nicaragua, 222 prisoners condemned for treason and other crimes were released. That evening, President Ortega told the story of why they were released and how their paymaster took them to the United States. These 222 defenders of freedom and democracy received money from the United States to organize and carry out extreme violence in the US-directed coup attempt of 2018 that killed 253 people and caused billions of dollars of damage to the economy. Never covered truthfully in the corporate press, this coup attempt lasted 3 months and was many times worse than what transpired in the United States on January 6, 2021, and also more destructive than the US-backed coup in Bolivia in 2019 against democratically elected President Evo Morales. Their crimes included assassination, the brutal torture of hundreds of Sandinistas, which they videotaped and put on social media. There are hundreds of these videos. Crimes also included kidnappings, rape, and extortion at over 1,000 roadblocks, known by the people as the roadblocks of death. They burned down public buildings, including municipal halls, dozens of schools, machinery parks for road repair, hundreds of homes of Sandinistas, ambulances, buses, and actual human beings. An amnesty was given in June 2019 with one condition, that they not commit new criminal acts. Nonetheless, these people chose to continue actions that harmed Nicaragua and its citizens. They conspired towards another coup. They requested economic sanctions, blockades, and even military intervention against Nicaragua. In 2021, they were arrested and tried for conspiracy, for treason, for committing acts that undermined the independence, sovereignty, and self-determination of the people, for inciting violence, terrorism, and economic destabilization of the nation. So on February 9th, President Ortega shared with the nation the story of how their expulsion came about. He mentioned how the US and the corporate media continually lambasted Nicaragua for having political prisoners, when even the US and their CIA knew better than anyone that all of these people had committed grave crimes. But since Nicaragua wants to live in peace and promote reconciliation, Vice President Rosario Murillo suggested that perhaps she could talk to the US ambassador to see if they would like to take the 222 prisoners to the US. Danielle said he wouldn't believe it until he saw it, but that she could certainly give it a try. So the vice president called Kevin Sullivan, and soon afterward, he had a trip scheduled to the US. When he returned, he said that indeed they would take the prisoners. And on February 9th, the State Department sent a plane to Managua to pick them up in the very early morning hours. They were flown to Dulles Airport, given 2 years during which they can work. They were given 3 nights at a hotel and $300. And the more famous ones who speak English were given dozens of interviews on the major media. In a speech about a year ago, Danielle had mentioned that probably the best thing would be to send the criminals to their boss in the United States. The National Assembly approved the special law that regulates the loss of nationality, where it indicates that those declared traitors can lose their nationality. So what's the legal basis for this decision? Article 1 of the Constitution states, independent sovereignty and national self-determination are inalienable rights of the people and foundations of the Nicaraguan nation. Any foreign interference in the internal affairs or any attempt to undermine these rights is an attempt against the life of the people. Nicaragua's decision is supported by 7 articles of the Constitution and 5 articles of the Penal Code, as well as the law for defense of the rights of the people to independence, sovereignty, and self-determination for peace. Those banished who violated the legal and constitutional order attempted against the state and the people, harming the interest of the nation. In total, 316 people have been deprived of citizenship. International bodies such as the UN Refugee Agency claim that this is illegal because the action was taken on an arbitrary basis, completely ignoring the evidence of what they had done. Deprivation of citizenship exists in most legal systems, including the United States and the United Kingdom. For example, the UK government has deprived 767 people of British citizenship since 2010, and also taken away UK passports from another 94 people. In the US, committing an act of treason can be grounds for losing citizenship or even death. The people of Nicaragua are well aware of what these 222 people caused during the coup attempt. The people accepted, forgave, but never forgot the kidnappings, tortures, and heinous crimes, nor their racist attitudes and colonial ambitions. Now I'm going to tell you about a few of the people in more detail. Cristiana Chamorro is part of the family of oligarchs that count 7 members as previous presidents and have owned various media outlets, including the newspaper La Prensa, funded by the US since the 1980s, when its primary focus was supporting the Contra. Cristiana was the director of the Violeta Barrios de Chamorro Foundation. This foundation was one of the main distributors of US money in Nicaragua. On June 2nd, 2021, just 5 months before the presidential elections, journalist William Grigsby revealed U.S. documents which showed that the U.S. openly channeled $17 million for the 2018 coup attempt through her foundation. There's a table that's going to come up that you can look at that has the funding. Just from USAID, the Chamorro Foundation received and channeled more than $7 million from 2014 to 2021, the year of the most recent presidential elections. The foundation also received money from other U.S. institutions, such as the National Endowment for Democracy, which spent $4.2 million in the 4 years leading up to the coup on media and other organizations. The foundation's main purpose was to channel funds to 25 opposition media outlets, several owned by the Chamorro family itself. For example, Confidencial and Esta Semana, both owned by Cristiana's older brother, Carlos Fernando, received some $2 million. And I'm sorry, I think it's her younger brother, but just those two received $2 million. Cristiana Chamorro and her other brother, Pedro Joaquin, a member of the foundation board, were found guilty of money laundering and of crimes of conspiracy in March 2022. From the time she was arrested until the time she was given her freedom, going to the United States, she was always allowed to serve her time in her mansion. Cristiana closed the Chamorro Foundation in February of 2021, saying she didn't want to comply with the Nicaraguan foreign agents law. She said the U.S. had audited their accounting and said it was all fine. Her statement offended many Nicaraguans who objected publicly, asking, which nation is she governed by? Under the Nicaraguan law, organizations receiving foreign funding must report on the use of the funds, similar to many other nations, once again, including the US and the UK. The main reason for any governments requiring nonprofits to register is to ensure they are not receiving foreign government money for political purposes. Exactly what was happening in Nicaragua. According to journalist William Grigsby and Liberal Party news analyst Enrique Quiñones, there was still some $7 million in the account when she closed it, and the money later appeared in her personal accounts. Medardo Mairena, Pedro Mena, and Francisca Ramirez are considered together because they were all leaders of the so-called rural workers movement, which controlled large areas of Nicaragua during the 2018 violence. They set up and managed many of the roadblocks of death. Mairena and Mena are among the 222, while Ramirez was already in self-exile. Costa Rica accused her of misusing funds aimed at helping Nicaraguan refugees. She was one of the 94 others found to be traitors and deprived of citizenship. Medardo Mairena and Pedro Mena were sentenced to 216 years in prison in 2019 for the July 12, 2018 brutal murder of 4 police officers and a young school teacher, as well as the kidnapping of 9 police officers in the small municipality of Morito. The Morito attack, one of the worst events in 2018, involving up to 200 armed assailants, is the subject of a film by Dick Emanuelson based on interviews with these survivors. The day after the murders and kidnappings, both Mairena and Mena tried to escape and were picked up at the Managua airport trying to flee. Evidence of their planning, the Morito massacre, was on their cell phones, was also substantiated by others who were present when the attack was planned. Mairena was also found guilty of 10 kidnappings, organized crime, aggravated robbery, and other things. He is one of the people in the first photo I showed being taken around Washington by Secretary of State Blinken. He and Pedro Mena are two of the people. Their sentences were to be 210 years, but they would only have served 30 years because in Nicaragua, only 30 years is allowed by law, nothing more. Both were set free in the June 2019 amnesty. But on July 5th, 2021, Mairena and Mena were arrested again and charged with the original crimes, having broken the terms of the amnesty by continuing to organize criminal activities. Dora Maria Tellez is seen as left-wing because she is a former guerrilla fighter. But after 1990, she shifted sharply right, supporting right-wingers such as oligarch Eduardo Montealegre, and also supporting the 2019 coup in Bolivia, in which the presidency was robbed from President Evo Morales. Tellez and many other MRS members were in frequent contact with the US Embassy in the years before 2018, as documented by WikiLeaks. In April 2018, Tellez was at the forefront of organizing the violent roadblocks in Masaya, one of the cities most affected by the violence. Starting on April 18th, the first day of the coup attempt, and on subsequent occasions, she was seen distributing money, food, drugs, and munitions to the criminals who were making I'm sorry, I lost my place, who were making violent attacks on Sandinistas, on Sandinista homes, on buildings, directly on the police, and later controlling the roadblocks. In December 2018, the National Police obtained a warrant and raided Carlos Chamorro's office, searching for evidence of coup activities. They found a receipt for $3,000 signed by Carlos Chamorro, made out to Tellez on the day the coup attempt began, April 18th. And I do have a copy of that someplace and forgot to include it. Her acts of treason also continued after the failed coup attempt. She called on the OAS to expel Nicaragua. In an interview with Confidencial, she expressed the hope that the Nicaraguan military leaders would launch a coup similar to the one she previously praised in Bolivia. And of course, she publicly lobbied the US to impose harsher sanctions on Nicaragua. Felix Maradiaga recently appeared on the PBS NewsHour and on NPR, where he was described as a former Nicaraguan presidential candidate, yet he has never been a leading political figure or electoral candidate. His nonprofit, IEP, was a major conduit for US funding prior to and during the coup attempt. Part of the money was then channeled for violence and destabilization. From the NED alone, it received at least $260,000. His organization trained students who were taught things like how to make false internet profiles, how to send messages that would cause terror and violence. One example was when millions of messages were sent out saying that the government killed a student on April 18. No one was killed that day. However, this led to great violence during the following days that shattered the public order across the nation. During the coup attempt, a gang leader named Cristian Mendoza, also known as Viper, was captured by the police. His full confession linked Maradiaga to organized crime and the plot to overthrow the government. Viper described a destabilization plan, channeling people's confusion and rage caused by the millions of fake messages into acts of violence. Another particular goal was to recruit people with as many arms as possible. Viper also stated that Maradiaga came to the Upoli, the Polytechnic University, to give money to the violent group that had taken it over from actual students in the first days of the coup attempt. A damaging video showed Maradiaga at the Upoli with a man called Pio Arellano, who was brandishing a handgun. And the link to that video is in the material that they have been posting in the chat. So there are a number of things where you can find detailed information, articles, documentaries, etc. Maradiaga sought sanctions against his own country at the Organization of American States in June 2018. He was presented as a Nicaraguan representative to the Organization of American States, to the Organization of American States General Assembly, without any permission or even prior notification to Nicaraguan authorities. On July 2nd, 2021, Maradiaga was sentenced to 13 years in prison for the crime of undermining national integrity to the detriment of the state and the Nicaraguan society. He had been planning further violence. Juan Sebastián Chamorro is a nephew of previous President Violeta Barrios de Chamorro. He was chosen by the US to head the Millennium Challenge Corporation under former neoliberal President Enrique Bolaños. The Millennium Challenge Corporation is another independent US foreign assistance agency created by Congress in 2004. The video you're about to see shows Chamorro's arrogant classism. You can see him yelling at a humble street vendor and calling him a come mierda, which is equivalent to a piece of shit. The humble man responds that he isn't a piece of shit like Chamorro because Chamorro sells out his country for dollars. So my time is up. Thank you very much. I hope you'll take a look at some of the articles and documents that are in the chat. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Nan, for that excellent presentation, very detailed presentation, actually setting out so well the realities of what has actually been going on in Nicaragua, and those are realities which the corporate media in both the US and the UK doesn't show us and doesn't want to show us. So thanks again, they're really, really excellent. We're now going to hear from our third speaker, Sarah Flounders. Sarah is a key leader of the International Action Center and the editor of the new second edition of Sanctions, A Wrecking Ball in a Global Economy, produced by the Sanctions Kill campaign. She has just returned from Nicaragua. Sarah Flounders, we're very pleased to hear from you. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you to the Nicaragua Solidarity Coalition and to all those who've worked for years those who put together today's webinar are long-time activists who really fought for Nicaragua. And I do want to, before I even speak, just highlight the two upcoming, as they explained, if you're interested in working with the Nicaragua Solidarity Coalition, tomorrow, Monday at 2:30 Eastern Time. And also we're really thrilled that on Tuesday at 3 p.m., the Padre Miguel de Scoto Brockman Center is hosting another webinar also on this book, Sanctions, A Wrecking Ball in a Global Economy, which is dedicated to Padre Miguel de Scoto Brockman, who was a liberation theologian, diplomat, a fighter, really someone who, as president of the UN General Assembly back in 2008, 2009, made many stunning contributions and worked with Ramsey Clark, with the International Action Center, and with many others to combat the use of sanctions. Now, Nicaragua is resistance. Nicaragua is built on a revolutionary process. And recognizing that is such an important part of what, even being in Nicaragua, reading about Nicaragua, defending Nicaragua, that we would do. Sanctions, a wrecking ball in a global economy, is part of a campaign to expose the pervasive US use of sanctions as a weapon, economic coercive measures against 40 countries, and more proposals every day. A third of the world population is in a country really battered by US sanctions. And that means every effort to destroy their economy and to create enormous shortages all the time. Now, when we look at that and consider a third of the world population, and yet it's unknown in the United States and not really part of the major media or any of the discourse, what is the impact of sanctions? And it's intentional. It's a very neutral seeming word. And we really need, in every sense, to make this a campaign that resonates with people across the world, that they understand it's as deadly as dropping a bomb, that when countries are prohibited from supplying essential medicines and the most basic products and food and pesticides and fertilizer, essential parts of electronic equipment to their population, those who suffer the most are the civilians, especially the poorest, the youngest, the seniors, those with any pre-existing conditions, the ability to do testing, and something like diabetes becomes a death sentence, a heart problem becomes an unsolvable problem, and yet there's medications easily accessible around the world. So intentionally depriving countries of basic food and medicine and the ability to support their own countries is intended as a disruption, and it's intended to demoralize populations, to undercut the enormous revolutionary enthusiasm that exists for change. It especially has a devastating impact on the many developing countries who are tied to cash crops. Suddenly they can't sell any of their products, and because they've been tied historically to these cash crops, they can't buy anything on the world market because of sanctions. So this is in every sense, a deadly, intentionally deadly tactic. So it always is tied also, and this is especially true, we can see in Nicaragua, it's tied to regime change operations. It's tied to, at the same time, National Endowment for Democracy, USAID, which is really the CIA funding That's how it is combined. It's tied to Contra forces who are intentionally disrupting, bombing, breaking everything that is essential. The book, therefore, is an attempt to tie this together and show in country after country what the impact of sanctions have done. One of the opening chapters by Ajamu Baraka of the Black Alliance for Peace deals with Nicaragua, the impact of the Renacer Act, and describing here is a country that by UN labels is labeled the second poorest country of the Americas, and yet providing free universal health care, free education. That is an incredible accomplishment. And it's the kind of thing that the Renacer Act was intended deliberately to undermine. That's where we need to see this connection, that when the US imposes sanctions on Nicaragua, Cuba, on Venezuela, but also on countries around the world, they are intentionally attempting to undermine. Consider in Syria, with an earthquake, and yet all of the enormous equipment from tents to emergency supplies that even the UN could provide are blocked because of the sanctions that are imposed on Syria. The ability of people to send urgently needed funds is also blocked, of international aid organizations is also blocked. So when we look at sanctions, they are intended to disrupt. Now, the days of the Monroe Doctrine are dead. They're long past. What the US is trying to reimpose, to recolonize, is US hegemony, US domination. And any and every country attempting independence and sovereignty is targeted with plans to stunt their growth, to bankrupt their economy. Now, the resistance, though, of Nicaragua, I want to say I just returned last week from a wonderful visit to Nicaragua, and special thanks to Colleen Littlejohn, and special thanks to those also putting on today's webinar. I found Nicaragua so beautiful, of course, so very green, but to see the many thousands of school children in uniforms, to see buses that operate for pennies and operate to every single city in Nicaragua, to see roads that are now the most advanced in all of Central America, and where it once took days, literally days, to reach the Atlantic coast, it's now a 4-hour drive. It's the improvement of the most basic things like infrastructure, free education, and not only free healthcare, but door to door. I was also in Nicaragua during the pandemic, where we saw, in terms of healthcare workers, Nicaragua was denied the vaccines that went to every other country in Central America, but because Nicaragua was sanctioned, they didn't get the US vaccines that were in very stingy amounts allocated to other countries, often very late, but they were getting them, but not Nicaragua. So Nicaragua, until the China vaccine, the Sinovac, arrived, Nicaragua used all sorts of measures of door-to-door attention, educating people determinately. I was so impressed by that. Not only were the schools and the medical clinics set up, but people knew in their homes what to do, and masks and hand washing and sanitizing and whatnot was everywhere. The whole population being actively educated. I was also, when you talk to people in Nicaragua, the number of adults and seniors in continuing education programs and all sorts of programs that there's no limit to education now in Nicaragua, and making it available means it's also available in the evenings. It's available in all kinds of programs. And it means that the children are not only taught, reading and writing and math skills, but music instruments and all sorts of skill sharing and having useful trades. These accomplishments, another big thing is Nicaragua is today 90% food self-sufficient. Now, that is maybe their best way to undercut the impact of sanctions, that it doesn't mean famine. It doesn't mean the starvation that it means in some countries where it's so very disruptive. Now, what the purpose of our book, Sanctions, a Wrecking Ball in a Global Economy, is to show both the interdependence of countries, the interdependence of countries, and yet how it can be grappled with in many countries, not only in Nicaragua. In many countries, they are making plans in their economy to defend their sovereignty, to defend their independence. So we've tried to provide both toolkits, PowerPoint presentations, so that you can teach what sanctions are, what they do, what the impact is in classes, in schools, in discussion groups, in church groups, and so on. We have lots of past sign-on statements, and I want to, in line with that, say something about a very important upcoming statement that we have. The other thing that we try to show is, along with the sanctions are never isolated alone. Along with them come the NED programs, National Endowment for Democracy, and the funding of all kinds of contra groups. And this was very true. I'm so glad there was an effort going into what 2018 meant in Nicaragua. Totally unprovoked and yet planned effort at regime change that has such a vicious impact. I hope that Yoav can post how you can get the sanctions book, how you can order as a free PDF online, as an EPUB online, or you can order the book, and that's at iacenter.org/sanctions-book. I posted it in the chat earlier. Hopefully we can post it again. But I want to take a minute now. If I do I have time still to do so? I want to keep within my time limit here.
You're doing fine, Sarah.
Okay, I want to read the statement that is being published in the days ahead, because the US also uses UN bodies. And by the way, we should also address that UN sanctions on so many countries were pushed through at US demand, such as against Syria, Iran, Iraq, Lebanon, Libya, and on, which have devastating impacts to this day. But other UN bodies are being used in very fraudulent ways, where little committees get set up and then their reports are released. So the UN Human Rights Report on Nicaragua, a statement was just leaked. It's a completely fraudulent report, and we want to answer it with hundreds of signatories denouncing this statement, denouncing this abuse of the UN. So I'm just going to quickly read it. UN Human Rights Report on Nicaragua is fatally flawed and should be withdrawn. Everyone on today's webinar, everyone who registered, will be getting a copy of this statement, and hopefully you'll sign it. But it reads, a report of the Group of Human Rights Experts on Nicaragua, released by the United Nations Human Rights Council on March 3rd, 2023, should never have been published. The following bullet points. It's extremely biased, based on material from only one side of what was a serious and prolonged conflict despite requirements to examine all alleged human rights violations and abuses committed in Nicaragua since April 2018. Second point, the claim that the group was unable to get material from the Nicaraguan government is false, because the government had already submitted very substantial documentation to both the United Nations and to the OAS, which was never taken into account by either body. Third, it completely fails to address the enormous damage done to ordinary people, businesses, public services by violent protesters in 2018, perpetrating a gross injustice against the human rights of thousands of Nicaraguans. Next point, it makes many allegations that are demonstrably wrong and do not withstand a simple checking of the facts. Last point, it was presented in a sensational, unprofessional manner, making unfounded, damaging slurs against Nicaraguan people and their government. And in conclusion, it says this report is an attempt to use multilateral human rights body to lend legitimacy to a regime change campaign and to justify sanctions. It's an abuse of the United Nations system. Instead of repeating these unsubstantiated claims against a country clearly being targeted for regime change by the United States, the UN Human Rights Council should be condemning the unilateral coercive measures the latter country has imposed on a third of humanity, which violate the UN Charter, kill thousands, and constitute crimes against humanity. If the UN Human Rights Council wants to help the people of sanctioned countries, it must advocate the immediate listing of coercive measures, which would create a climate more favorable to the enjoyment of civil and political rights. If the UNHCR wants to facilitate peace and reconciliation in Nicaragua, it must examine the testimony of ordinary Nicaraguans and the findings of the Nicaraguan Commission for Truth, Justice, and Peace. The spurless, unprofessional report published by this what's called Group of Human Rights Experts on Nicaragua on March 3rd, 2023 must be withdrawn. So if you're interested in signing on to that, we'll be sending it out to you. In conclusion, I do want to say that the sanctions that the US is imposing around the world are failing. That countries increasingly are trading and expanding sanctioned countries with each other. The sanctions on Russia, the largest amount of sanctions ever passed, more than 5,000 by the US and the EU, the G7 countries, was not picked up by any of the countries of the global South. The countries of Latin America, of Africa, of most of Asia refused to go along with these sanctions. And a new day of new currencies, new exchanges, new assistance to each other is opening up. The sanctions are still creating enormous hardships. The US has just introduced the largest military budget in its history. And there's every effort to continue war, to continue sanctions, to continue contra groups, to continue national endowment for quote unquote democracy. It's not that at all. Funding to their forces around the world. But it's being shown that cooperation is the way forward, that new forms of exchange will break US hegemony. And this is, I think, what we need to look forward to with great confidence. We think and we hope that this book will be a contribution, giving a whole picture, listing the countries sanctioned, the bodies that carry out these sanctions. They come from many different US government agencies, and giving people concrete ways that they can resist. So thank you, and thank you for today's webinar.
Thank you, Sarah Flounders. That was great. And we have posted how people can access your book in the chat several times. So we hope people will take advantage of that opportunity. We also posted Dan's book again, so people can access that. This has been a very stimulating session so far, and we thank all three of our speakers. Now we're turning to the question and answer period. And for that, we're also including John Perry, who's been on hand. He is an author and a resident of Masaya, Nicaragua, who lived through the attempted coup. And he also has been working very hard in a response, a collective response, but he is one of the key authors of it, of the UN so-called human rights report. So he's available also to answer questions. And so I think we'll start by giving John a chance to just talk for a moment about any comments he'd like to make, preliminarily at least, about the human rights report and some of the most important things that the audience ought to hear about it.
It might just be worthwhile thinking about the way that the UN Human Rights Report was presented. It led to a description, a headline, in fact, in the New York Times, saying that Nicaragua was becoming like Nazi Germany, and that word Nazi has been repeated several times, and it came from the chair or the president of the expert group, Jan Michael Simon, who's German. And he actually used that description about Nicaragua, which is completely absurd. We've heard, I think, that the UN report largely covers events in 2018. So it's 5 years since these events took place. And it has to be understood in the context of the severity of the problems which the protests and the attempted coup caused. I mean, it's estimated that the damage to infrastructure was $1 billion. And 120,000 people lost their jobs, quite apart from the fact that 250 people were killed, 22 police officers died, and 401 were injured. So there were enormous effects in a small country. Compare that with what happened on January the 6th, 2020 in the capital, when an afternoon's violence led to, I think, the maximum of 5 deaths, $2 million worth of damage. And is now being responded by the US justice system with punitive prison sentences on many of those involved. In Nicaragua, there were prison sentences, but as Nan said, there was an amnesty in July 19, and even before that amnesty, many of the people initially arrested, for example, in Masaya, where I live, were released conditionally within a few weeks or even days of being arrested, after the events were brought to a close on July the 17th, 2018, when the police and volunteer police moved into the city. So I think, we have to get these things into perspective. And the sensationalist treatment of the UN Human Rights Report is clearly designed to perpetuate the idea that Nicaragua is seriously abusing human rights, just at the point when it's made this amazingly generous gesture of releasing 222 criminals who are now enjoying the freedom of the United States.
Thank you, John. Louise, do you have a question for the speakers? Louise, you're muted.
Okay. All right now. Okay, just maybe Dan could answer this first. The question was from Elizabeth. What was the interest and gain of the Americans? Anybody else who want to answer as well?
The interest and gain of the Americans in general in Nicaragua, I guess, is the question, or what are the interests the U.S. has in Nicaragua over the years? If I understand that to be the question.
Yeah.
Well, it's several-fold. One, the U.S. for many, many years has coveted the possibility of a canal through Nicaragua. Right now, the Panama Canal is becoming pretty obsolete, even though it's been expanded a bit. It cannot handle the traffic and the size of ships, modern ships today. And so the U.S., even, back to the 19th century, has wanted a canal through Nicaragua, and it still wants one because it could build a bigger one than the one in Panama because of the giant lake that Nicaragua has, which could, if you cut through the land that attaches the Pacific Ocean and the Atlantic, and you went through that lake, you could have, accommodate shipping that actually goes even both ways at the same time. So, and the U.S. initially intervened in Nicaragua with the Marines in 1910, in part for fear that President Jose Zelaya at that time was going to work with the Japanese in building a canal. And that is a no-no under the Monroe Doctrine for a country like Nicaragua to work with an outside power like Japan on a canal. Of course, now the U.S. fears that Nicaragua may work with China on such a project. But the other, so that's a kind of purely, economic, geopolitical issue. But the other issue, and it's been touched upon a little by the speakers, and I cite this in my book, I think Oxfam International put it best when they said that in the 80s, the U.S. was trying to counter the danger of a good example. The U.S. does not want, particularly in its hemisphere, a country like Nicaragua going its own way politically, going its own way economically, and setting the example that that is possible and that you can fight poverty, you can fight extreme poverty, you can create progressive social programs, you can create a different society than that which the U.S. is promoting, again, particularly in the hemisphere, of this hyper-capitalist system tied to the Western economy, in which your economy, if you're a developing country, is really subservient to the economic interest of the U.S. The fact that Nicaragua has been able to successfully create an alternative model to that is something the U.S. has wanted to destroy since day one, since the beginnings of the Sandinista revolution. And Nicaragua continues to represent the danger of that good example. If the U.S. had its druthers, it would, make Nicaragua Haiti, essentially. And Haiti, by the way, is the most intervened country in the hemisphere by the United States. Nicaragua is probably the second most intervened country. But Nicaragua has been able to withstand that intervention in a way, very, very sadly, Haiti has not been able to. So that is my quick response to that question.
Thanks very much, Dan. Did anybody else wish? Oh, Sarah, you wish to make a comment?
Yes. Just to follow that same point, because Nicaragua being labeled a national security threat to the U.S., you think, how is that even possible? How does a rational person even claim that? But it is exactly as Dan said. They are a threat because a good example is a threat. And just to be really acutely aware of that the role of the U.S. military, the role of all the U.S. agencies and departments is to defend capitalism and U.S. corporate rule. That's why they exist. And anyone who challenges that, whether it's the pharmaceutical companies and the medical industry right here, or the very idea of building infrastructure that is of assistance to people, this is all deeply threatening. And so we can see it from the beginning of, you can look at the Cuban Revolution and Venezuela to know that Nicaragua is deeply threatened, because threatening to the US and other countries looking at that example are more encouraged to make their own efforts of change.
Okay. Thank you, Sarah. Thanks, Dan, too. Okay, Barbara.
Okay, so I'm going to try to combine two questions here. One is from Amrit Randai, and the second is from Jorge Capellan. So why are various countries of CELAC joining in on the attacks against Nicaragua and calling for more unilateral coercive measures? And then second, why has why have the Latin American progressive parties betrayed the Sandinista revolution, offering citizenship to the likes of Luis Posada Carriles? Those two, to me, seem to go together a little bit. So I'm hoping that you can address those together. Could we start with Nan and then anybody else who would like to answer?
I think that the problem is this. The only countries really in the Caribbean and Latin America that really do have power because their police and their army are out of the people, from the people, in favor of the people, are Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua. All of the other countries that now are included in this new pink tide, Colombia, Chile, etc., Argentina, they don't have independence. They might have gotten into the presidency, but their militaries and their police are controlled by the oligarchy and by the United States government. So I think their survival, and we only have to look at Peru to see how their president, who right now is in jail, who was a teacher from the countryside and indigenous campesino, he was trying to do some things, and basically the oligarchy of the US found a way and arrested him, and he's in jail. He's going to be tried, and who knows what's going to happen. And that was all because he was just trying to make a few good changes, like tax the wealthy corporations. So I think a lot of these countries, I mean, I blame them. I think it's terrible how they're behaving. But I do get that they want to hold on to power and to go along with the US in the media war against Nicaragua. And that's what we've had. I mean, 2018 was a real violent war. But since then, the kind of destabilization we have, the US, it's really been a media war. And they've gotten their lackeys to go along with it, even though they're supposedly sort of leftists. So go ahead, somebody else.
That's exactly.
Yeah, I think that's right. I would just add that, I think also, I think a lot of these, leaders are as susceptible to propaganda as other people are. I think that the disinformation against Nicaragua is very thick, very hard for people to see through and weed through. I think many people are still under a lot of misunderstanding about what happened in 2018. And that's why we are doing these types of webinars to try to educate people about that. I think the other thing, that people, and I guess this really builds on what Nan said, I don't think Nicaragua gets, and Danielle and the Sandinistas don't get enough credit for how radical they are. I mean, they are more radical than these other pink tie governments, is the truth. And that's what Nan was saying. I mean, I think back to just a couple examples of this. When Manuel Zelaya was overthrown in Honduras in 2009, who took him in? Nicaragua. Provided he and his wife shelter. And of course, his wife is now president of Honduras. When during the time NATO was bombing Libya, when Libya's ambassador to the UN resigned and Libya was left without any representation at the UN in New York City, Daniel Ortega took it upon himself to appoint Father Miguel de Scoto, the ambassador of Libya to the United Nations, right, to offer his services. These are very radical things that Nicaragua was willing to do. They are willing to stick their neck out in a way that, again, other leaders from countries that are not as radical are not willing to do. And I just think that is hard for these other governments to abide by. And but I think it's a testament to Nicaragua and again, how progressive and radical and revolutionary they are.
Okay.
Yeah. Oh,
Thanks. Anyone else?
well, I'll very much.
Okay.
I'll very much agree with Nan's point and Dan, and to point out that what Nicaragua has is an army and police created out of the Nicaraguan Revolution. And that is also what enabled the Sandinistas to survive the terrible years of right-wing domination and to, as they say, rule from below, gain power and organize from below. That the army and the police in Nicaragua still substantially are very loyal to the Sandinista revolution and came out of or formed in that way, whereas many of the other countries where there is an electoral victory, they are still coping with a military trained at the School of the Americas with police units that operate really under U.S. command. And it means that independence can be, sovereignty can be temporary at best.
I'd just like to make a point about the nature of the opposition in Nicaragua. It's very two-faced. So in the events of 2018, we saw no political program coming from these people. Their only program was to get rid of Daniel Ortega. And this meant that they could go to the US and present themselves to Mike Pompeo, Mike Pence, and so on in the Trump administration as friends of Trump. Felix Maradiaga and Juan Sebastian Chamorro were doing that. At the same time, people like Dora Maria Tellez, Sergio Ramirez, Gioconda Belli could present themselves as friends to the soft left figures in Latin America like Gustavo Petro and Lula and Boric and so on. And this has enabled them to cultivate both sides. And of course, the soft left in Latin America very often were friends with these people or continue being friends with some of these people and naturally listen to them. And of course, this is then backed up by what they're reading in the New York Times and even in press on the left in the hemisphere, including the press in Chile and Argentina. So we have to, I think, pay tribute almost to the skills of the opposition in manipulating the media and their political contacts over the years. And that's why we're seeing this happening now in Latin America, where many of the leaders are still against the Nicaraguan government.
Okay, thanks everyone. Okay, the next question is about solidarity. The question is, what kind of solidarity do Nicaraguans want from groups in the United States? Nan, would you like to answer that first? And
Sure.
Maybe John?
Sure.
Yeah.
I'd say, they want respectful solidarity, not solidarity that says, well, why aren't you doing it this way? Or why aren't you doing it that way? Recognizing that Nicaragua and their people have a right to vote for the candidate they want, run their country as they want, and that they do hold independence, sovereignty very, very high. I would also right there put in a plug for coming to Nicaragua in any form. I mean, come on a vacation. I mean, it's great to organize a group and come and meet with different people and learn about everything, but not everyone can do that. At least if you can take the money and the time, just come visit, because that will give you the ability to go back and talk about what you saw. And I assure you, you'll see an amazing, amazing small country that has moved so far ahead in things like drastically reducing poverty and making the lives of the people so much better.
Okay. Anyone else? John, did you wish to comment?
Well, Nicaragua's just been elected the friendliest country in the world, I think, by some poll. And apart from that, it's also one of the safest countries in Latin America. I think currently the second safest in terms of numbers of homicides. So yeah, please come. Come on a political delegation or just come as a tourist and see for yourself. I think the important thing that Nicaragua now needs is for people to get across the truth of what's happening here and the developments of the revolution and trying to counter this terrible propaganda that's being put forward in the national media and led by the US government.
Yeah, I just could I add something just from the United Kingdom, from our point of view, because we have links with a lot of trade unions, community groups, cooperatives in Nicaragua. And it's really important. A big part of our job in support of Nicaragua is about telling the truth, getting the truth out there, putting out what Nicaraguans are saying, what these groups are saying, as opposed to, because the corporate media in the UK, the Guardian, the BBC, is simply awful, just as bad as the corporate media in the United States. I think the other thing I would agree, now, as you've said, everybody that we've had from the UK who goes to visit Nicaragua, they come back and tell us how joyful it is and how different it is from the picture portrayed in corporate media. So that's so important. Also, the other thing we do when we can is to have visitors to the UK from Nicaragua, because we then organize meetings with those people from Nicaragua, and people can actually hear about what's really going on in the country. So I think there's lots sort of our group and your groups can actually do and working together on that. Thanks.
Okay. Oh, did somebody else have a comment? No. Okay, moving on then to another question from Alicia Foster. She asks, and this is for all the panelists, do you have any tips on how to be more discerning of information about international politics and economics, given that so much of it is for maintaining U.S. hegemony? Dan, you want to go first?
I'll try. Yeah, I mean, it's a very good question. I mean, it's not an easy question to answer. I mean, I think, first of all, honestly, I've more or less given up on the mainstream press. I don't spend any time listening to it or reading it so much anymore, because I have found it so disappointing and so misleading. You know, so what do? I mean, you find sources you trust. Many times they're out of the country that you want to study. I mean, you know, you listen to other voices, I think, first of all, again, from the people who are being impacted in those countries. You know, I have the sources that I trust. I mean, in Nicaragua, let's just focus on Nicaragua for the moment. I think Tortilla con Sal has been something that I've found very useful as a source there. The Alliance for Progressive Action and their Nika Notes is very excellent. Also, Popular Resistance is very good. You know, so these are things that I've come to trust over the years. And a lot of the people that are on this webinar write for those publications. And so I think, you know, you find the sources you trust. Obviously, people, yeah, Koha has some great stuff that was just put up. You know, people mention visiting to these places. I can't say enough about trying to do that. I know that's not with everyone within the means of everyone, but I think visiting a place like Nicaragua, visiting a place like Syria, for example, Iran, going to these places and seeing the reality, there's no substitute for that. And that's what a lot of us learned in the 1980s. And I think that's, you know, something I try to do. Every year I go to several of these places, and there's just no substitute for it. And then by doing that, of course, you learn, you know, who your sources are that you come to believe in. But I think, you know, you start from the proposition that the mainstream press is not reliable and should be questioned at every turn.
Others who would like to address that? John, yeah.
I'd just like to make a plug, both for the Council on Hemispheric Affairs, which Dan mentioned, but also fairness and accuracy in reporting. I have to declare an interest because I write for them, but they are very good, not just on Nicaragua, but on other issues. And they do get behind some of the lies and misinformation in the mainstream media. So it's worth checking them out.
Yes.
Okay.
And
The next question, I'm not sure this. Sorry, Barbara. Yeah.
oh, I was just going to say, I posted this in the chat already, but nicasolidarity.net is the website for Nicaragua Solidarity Coalition. And our goal is to begin posting a lot more information there. So keep checking that out.
You know, I hello?
Go ahead, Sarah.
Okay. I think the most important rule of thumb is whenever the corporate media with almost one voice is screaming about a particular country or even a particular issue, be suspicious. Be suspicious, because corporate power has a reason for pushing and promoting, and that's the time to go looking for alternative information. If suddenly you're seeing a story everywhere from Washington Post, the New York Times, and so on and so forth, then you know something is afoot. And I think all of the sources that were just listed are excellent, are worth following, and worth, you know, how do you find alternative information? But the first step is to distrust the corporate media today, which exists as really an arm of the and the U.S. establishment. It exists to distort and to lie. Thanks.
Louise, I'd like to add one more thing myself before moving on to your next question. Just ask yourself, anytime you see something that maybe there's just a little question in your mind, who stands to gain by this statement? Who would benefit if this really happened? Okay, go ahead.
Fine. Okay, we've got lots of questions coming in now, but we may have to make this one our last question. So this is from Magda. She says, do you consider the last statement of the Pope against Nicaragua a new escalation of the sanctions? I don't know whether, Sarah, would you like to answer that one? Or anyone?
The new statement.
I just heard about it. I think it's brand new. Something I think they said something about, let's see if I can, you want to go to a different question? I'll try to pull it up.
We'll do a different question. Well, yeah, because I think that's very, very recent. Okay, just another question. Is the decision to free the prisoners controversial among the Sandinistas? It seems dangerous to let them free to possibly organize another coup. That question comes from Jessica. Anybody like to answer that one? John?
It was certainly talked about a lot, but I think it was seen, as Daniel Ortega portrayed it, as a step towards peace. You know, let's release these people, send them off to the US, and let's take away their citizenship so that they can't be used to create a false government in exile, as happened with Venezuela and Juan Guaido. So the protests that have taken place internationally, that these people have sadly lost their citizenship, has to be seen in that context, that, you know, they were being set up, some of these people were being set up as Juan Guaido type figures before the 21 election, if they'd been allowed to stand. And now that they're in exile, they would have been perfectly placed to be manipulated by Washington in that position again. So I think it's very clear that the reason that they've lost their citizenship is so they can't be used in that way.
Okay, thank you. Right, okay. Did you want to come back on the previous question at all, anybody, or that's something we may need to? Yes, sorry, Nan, thanks.
I will. So apparently what Vatican News says is that the Holy See has taken note of the report of the group of, quote, human rights experts that John was talking about, and that we're developing a response to, because it's just totally full of lies. of course. But the Holy See expresses deep concern about the upsurge of violence across the country, which the only upsurge in violence comes from the opposition themselves, like Bishop Alvarez. And so I think that Nicaragua has, because of what the Vatican has said, I think they've temporarily suspended relations with the Vatican. So that's all I can tell you right now.
And it's not surprising, given that the church within Nicaragua has played such a treacherous role. I mean, the Vatican's getting their information from their clergy and bishops within Nicaragua, who really, since Abando Bravo died, they've just been absolutely terrible. Really, and I write about this in my book, in the last decades, the church in Nicaragua has really been taken over by the right-wing Opus Dei. I mean, these are really right-wing clergy. These are not liberation theologians. Let's be clear. There are a few left in Nicaragua, but not so many. But it's mostly the mainstream church has been taken over by these right-wing Opus Dei folks who, in 2018 were found, some of the churches were found with caches of arms in the churches. People were tortured in those churches, overseen by some of the clergy. So these are the types of people the Vatican are hearing from, and so I think, if people are Roman Catholic, they should be, telling the Vatican what's really happening there, because they're getting their information from everyone else.
Okay. Oh, Nan?
I just thought I'd like to say a little bit more about Bishop Alvarez, because he's one of the ones who there are just so many lies about him in the corporate media. He and two other bishops were part of the organization of the coup. And in recent years, he probably has maintained the biggest role from the pulpit in openly asking people to do things to destabilize and try to overthrow the elected government. He also has a number of radio stations and TV stations in Matagalpa, and U.S. money from all the typical sources, USAID, the net, et cetera, was going to those media, to support those media and the kind of counter-revolutionary things they were doing. But the money was also being given to others for violent actions. So he was picked up in August. He was indicted. He was allowed for months he's another one from the oligarchy, to live in the family mansion and enjoy the servants, the food, et cetera, et cetera. He had the chance to go on February 9th to the United States. He had been found guilty. He had not yet been sentenced, and he didn't want to go. So he didn't go. And the next day he was sentenced to 26 years in prison, and now he is in prison.
Sarah, you had a comment?
Well, I think we know the role that the Vatican is playing now, and the kind of pressure, and Nan just described very well the pressure that's coming, particularly from right-wing forces. But this isn't surprising. This is a role of the church. There was a breakthrough for a short period of time when people's movements were very strong, and that got reflected within the church. But over a long period of time, the influence of the U.S. and the EU and really corporate power is pervasive, and the institutions that put out statements, we shouldn't be surprised that the Pope would echo those statements. That's where his information comes from, and frankly, that's his role. So it doesn't mean in any way that Nicaragua should be defensive, in my opinion, at all. They've made every provision and they've produced every kind of report, and they've given those that they expelled every opportunity to change their ways. They're totally tied to the US, and that's where they were sent. What more can you say? I think it's dangerous in one way because, of course, the Pope still has a big hold on a lot of people's minds, and but doesn't certainly make history. The people do, so that they resent.
Thank you to everyone for your presentations and your comments, and also to the audience for all the great questions. Unfortunately, we didn't get all of them answered. We answered quite a few, I think, and we want to thank everybody for attending. I just want to point out, for anybody who doesn't already know this, if you would like to save all of the information that's in the chat for yourselves, I don't know if this works on a phone, but I know it works on a laptop, that you can go on the chat to the bottom, and you'll see on the very right-hand side at the bottom 3 little dots. And if you click on those dots, you should get an option to save the entire chat, and then you'll have the information that was shared with you today. And so I guess with that, we should wrap up. And maybe each person could say just a last few words who are on the speakers, and Louise also. Sarah?
Just to unmute. I really want to thank, the Sanctions Kill book is an anthology of a whole number of different authors dealing with different countries, different struggles. And I've always kind of loved working on anthologies because you're putting together quite a number of people, different areas of expertise, and different techniques of explaining things. So I'm the editor of the book, Sanctions, a Wrecking Ball in a Global Economy, but it is an anthology with a number of authors, a number of sources, a list of webinars and resources. So I hope people will look at it as a teaching tool and an explaining tool, and it will encourage them to produce their own material. And thank you for the organizers of today. I'll join you on other calls and on every effort, because defending Nicaragua is part of defending people's movements and revolutionary gains.
Yeah, I just want to thank everyone for, everyone who organizes, everyone who attended on a Saturday afternoon. It shows how important Nicaragua is to us. I first went there when I was 19 years old in 1987, and it changed my life. And it continues to enrich me, and the people involved in Nicaragua continue to enrich my life. And there's that great quote by Che Guevara that the greatest attribute of a revolutionary, is love. And I think that when you go to Nicaragua and you're involved in Nicaragua, you witness that love and experience that in great measure. And I think that's what keeps us tied to that country. And so thank you, everyone, for being a part of that. Thank you very much.
I put my email in the chat. If people still have questions or comments, you can also feel free to write to me. And I also just appreciate very much all of our speakers, all of our organizers, and all of you who took your time on a Sunday afternoon. Bye.
Bye-bye.
You join the Nicaragua Solidarity Coalition if you're in the US, or in the UK, join the Nicaragua Solidarity Campaign.
Could I just offer a friendly amendment to that? The Nicaragua Solidarity Campaign and Nicaragua Solidarity Campaign Action Group are working in coalition with the Nicaragua Solidarity Coalition. So we're all in this together. And also we're welcoming people from other countries. We've got people already from Mexico, Bolivia, Canada, and Colleen is working on getting some from Denmark. So we'll see where we go from there.
Did you want, just from me, just to say thank you for allowing me to be part of this excellent webinar and really, really inspiring. For any of you participants who are in the UK, I've put my email address on the chat as well, so do get in touch with me. It's been a real pleasure, and also just to add to what Dan was just saying, that I first went to Nicaragua in the early 80s, so that's a long time ago, and still retain my passion for that country and to defend its people and its sovereignty. It deserves all of our support. Also, just to say, I'm about to have dinner because it's dinner time in the UK. It's about 9 p.m. here, so but thanks everybody.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. Bye for now.
Bye-bye.